Welcome everybody to this RSA session for the Samuel Johnson Prize, which is essentially dedicated to the idea that truth isn't just stranger than fiction, it's better than it. There will be novelists who object to that, but in this room, in this company, that proposition is incontrovertible tonight. That's what we're going with. Welcome to the live audience as well. This is being streamed so that people are listening to it on the internet or following it on the internet. You at home don't have to put your phones on silent. I think that would be too intrusive. But we'd be very grateful if you would hear, because we are being filmed. If you want to comment or disagree or just kind of type out some inchoate screech of rage, the Twitter hashtag is #SJPrize. And obviously, unless you've come into the wrong room completely, I don't need to tell you that that's the Samuel Johnson Prize. It's in its 16th year now, the prize. And since it was first handed out in 1999, the first prize winner was Anthony Beevor with Stalingrad. It's established itself as really the preeminent prize for non-fiction books. That may have something to do with the fact that the prize winner gets £20,000, but I think it's mostly to do with the fact that the judges for the prize are always people who know how hard it is to achieve excellence in non-fiction. This year is no exception. The chair of the prize this year is Claire Tomlin, an award-winning biographer. On her panel, she has Alan Johnson, who won the Orwell Prize for his book This Boy. She's got Ray Monk, who won several awards for his biography of Wittgenstein. So they're people who know how difficult it is to get to this stage. We're very lucky to have almost a full house for you today. We are missing one person. Greg Grandin, whose book The Empire of Necessity is about a slave rebellion off the Chile coast. He can't be here tonight. He's flying in tomorrow for the award ceremony, but we have everybody else. And they are, in order, John Campbell, who's here to talk about his biography of Roy Jenkins, A Well-Rounded Life. Next to him, Alison Light. She's here to talk about her book Common People, which is an account of family history and much more. Caroline Moorhead, who tells an extraordinary story of resistance in a very remote part of France in her book Village of Secrets. Marion Coutts, whose book is about her husband's terminal illness. Her book is The Iceberg. And then finally, Helen MacDonald, her book H is for Hawk, also about grief in a way, but also about the experience of training a goshawk. It's immediately apparent. I haven't even touched on the richness and complexity of these books in those very short descriptions, but I hope we're going to get into it a little bit now. And what we're going to do is we're going to hear readings from all of the books, and then I will talk directly to each author in turn. And then we will throw it open to you, so you can ask the blazingly obvious question, which I've somehow forgotten to ask at the end. And because I don't want to cut into that time, we're going to start straight away. John, perhaps you could start reading.
Start with the reading.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Roy Jenkins' 2 years at the Home Office, actually less than 2 years, are a classic example of the right man in the right job at the right time. Half a century later, his brief tenure still excites admiration and controversy in equal measure. Coinciding with the height of Beatlemania, the miniskirt, the contraceptive pill and swinging London, but also with the Rolling Stones, the drug scene and the first Vietnam War demonstrations, the period 1965 to 67 now appears, for good or ill, a turning point in the social history of the country, a halcyon time of personal liberation or the onset of national decadence. Of course, Jenkins did not create, but only reflected, the new moral climate which 20 years of peace and growing affluence suddenly produced in the mid-60s. But he was far more in tune with the changing times than most Home Secretaries. He was openly on the side of the youth revolution, not against it. And if a 45-year-old balding politician could hardly be its patron saint, he was certainly its benevolent sponsor.
Anybody who's read your biography will know that he was not just interested in the permissive society in theory, Roy Jenkins. He put it into practice to a certain degree. Your book is an official biography. That can sometimes mean a lack of candour. It's absolutely not the case here. What was your access to information?
Oh, I had complete access to information. I was very fortunate. I've written biographies before, but never an official biography. This time I was appointed by Jennifer Jenkins and given full access to Roy Jenkins' papers, which were then still housed in the attic of their house in East Hendred. So I had full access to that.
And did you have any misgivings about it being an official biography?
Not really, no. I knew that, Jenkins himself was a biographer. His family knew what biography involved. Jenkins, in his own book reviews of other people's biographies, was always hard on authors who glossed over the personal side. I think I knew, Jennifer Jenkins knew, that there were aspects of his life which I think she probably hoped I wouldn't make too much of, but I couldn't gloss them over. I don't think I have sensationalized them, but I have given them full weight. They were a very important part of his life, and I have reflected that, I hope, in a well-rounded life.
But it's interesting that you felt that, as it were, your subject himself gave you license by his own biographical method.
I think very much so, yes. I think, it's interesting. It's a biography of a biographer, to some extent.
It has a fascinating early passage about his friendship with Tony Crossland, and that's one of those points at which you have to kind of choose how far you go. It was clearly a friendship that was very, very intense, and to some degree sexual as well.
I think to a small degree sexual. I don't think it should be exaggerated. I think there was a certain amount of bisexuality going on at Oxford in that time. Tony Crossland was quite openly, I think, gay. Obviously, Roy very definitely was not, but he had this very intense adolescent, rather as the Daily Telegraph, somebody in the Telegraph quite rightly said, it was a very Brideshead. It was a very Sebastian Flight. But it was very political. They were arguing about socialism and fascism and the class war. Roy was 2 years younger than Tony Crossland, was very much at that stage under his influence. So there may have been. It was quite an intense relationship. You've seen, we've got mainly Tony's letters rather than Roy's, but he does address Tony as my angel, my pet, and things which even for the standards of the time, I think is going slightly further than normal friendship.
And Roy Jenkins sort of confessed that he'd been seduced once.
He did. He
did.
did. I haven't revealed my source on that one, but he did confess that something may have happened once. But I really do not think this should be taken out of context and treated as a great revelation. And the fact that he was legalizing homosexuality in the 1967 because he was thinking of himself.
Well, you've gone ahead of my next question, but right. It must have been part of the context, mustn't it? That he had a different sense of what it was to, how a kind of social liberalism could work. It must have fed into his thinking.
Yes, but I think they
it.
all... in the debates about homosexuality in the 60s, and no one ever admitted to knowing a homosexual, and yet obviously they all did. But it was all it was not talked about. But they all knew that there was something that a lot of perfectly decent people that they all knew were being treated as a criminal offence and had to be legalised. I don't think he was more anxious to do it for his own personal reasons. It was part of the same thing. He had no personal interest in the abortion bill. He wasn't particularly interested in theatre censorship. He went, but he could see that these were archaic laws that were making Britain in the 1960s ridiculous and Victorian and needed to be swept away. And he had this agenda of all these things that he wanted to do, which he'd been campaigning for since the 50s. And fortunately, he was Home Secretary at just the right time to be able to push that agenda through. And he did, as I say, a remarkable amount in a very short time.
He was held responsible by a lot of politicians who came after, and they blamed him, in effect, for sort of opening Pandora's box. Do you think he was, or he was just in the right place at the right time, and he was sufficiently efficient to get it through?
Well, I think it took a lot of determination and skill of him to get it through. I mean, both the homosexuality and abortion things, he didn't do as government bills. He picked up private members' bills that were introduced by Leo Abse on the one hand and David Steele on the other. But they would not have got through. Like most private members' bills, they would have died a death if it hadn't been for the government giving them time. And Jenkins had to fight in Cabinet. Cabinet was pretty reluctant to put through either of those things, but he had to fight to get the government time for them. So I think it was necessary that somebody with that persistence, and I mean a lot of credit to Harold Wilson as well, who wasn't particularly keen on either of them, but knew when he appointed Jenkins to the Home Office that this was what he wanted to do and supported him in doing them. And I think that, credit is due to Wilson as well, but it was Jenkins who really pushed them through.
The other great set piece of your book is the SDP, obviously, and the founding of the SDP. You obviously admire him as a character, and there is much to admire. I mean, he's witty, he is talented, he's hard-working, contrary to the rumours about his laziness. You find him guilty of prevarication over exactly how far they were going to go in the SDP and the Liberal link. I wondered what you felt was his greatest failing as a politician.
His greatest failure as a politician was that I suppose he did rather... I mean, as leader, he wasn't a good leader of the SDP. Once he was very brave and clear-sighted and courageous in setting the thing up. He wasn't very good as a party leader. He wasn't good, and he wouldn't have been very good probably if he'd ever become leader of the Labour Party. He wasn't good at the nitty-gritty of party management. He was good at making big speeches. He was decisive as a minister. He wasn't really good at what you might call low politics. And I think he was very sociable among his friends. He was actually fairly shy with people he didn't know, and he wasn't good at the sort of backslapping side of political leadership.
He was pretty good for a shy man, though, wasn't he? I mean, you write this wonderful sentence. The two most important girlfriends of his middle and later years were the wives of two of his best friends. In the upper-class society of the 50s and 60s, this was not unusual. It must have been a tiny bit unusual, surely. Your best friends?
Well, all I can say, it is quite difficult to explain this to a younger generation, I think. But it is the case that this was not something that made great waves among the society he moved in. Everybody knew of this. Nobody talked about it. As long as, I mean, I have had it explained to me directly that the philosophy was that you only had affairs within strong marriages. So there were no broken marriages, no broken hearts, no scandal. And as long as there was no scandal, I think he wasn't the only one who was doing this sort of thing. If you think about it, most of the, people say, how did this not get into the newspapers? If you think of most of the recent political scandals of recent years, of Cecil Parkinson or David Blunkett or anyone, it's usually an aggrieved partner, usually the woman, who goes to the press and makes a story. If nobody goes to the press with the story, there isn't a scandal. And in Jenkins' case, it was in nobody's interest to make a scandal out of it, and there was no scandal. And Jennifer accepted this as long as there was no scandal.
To put it crudely, he always dallied upwards, didn't he, up the social ladder, which led to him being accused of being a social climber and having betrayed his roots. Do you think he was a social climber? What was the nature of his fascination with?
A lot of the nature of his fascination was historical, actually. As a historian and biographer who had written a lot about the Edwardian and Victorian periods, he loved the sort of resonance of ancient names and titles. I don't think he was interested in boring aristocrats. He was interested in the interesting ones, but I don't think he was a social climber per se. And I do deny that he really... I mean, obviously his father was a coal miner, so there was a great social mobility. But by the time Roy Jenkins was born, his father was already a councillor, a high union official, all the rest of it. He was MP for Pontypool by the time Roy Jenkins was 15. He was then Attlee's PPS during the war when he was Deputy Prime Minister. Jenkins grew up in the heart of the Labour Party, in the heart of what was becoming a governing establishment. And he didn't think there was any sense of betrayal. My first chapter is called His Father's Son. He was very much... The ambition, the social climbing, in a sense, was done by his father, not by Roy. So I don't think there's any betrayal of class roots at all.
That gives me a cue to move on, because I want to move on to Alison Light, because your book, Common People, in a sense, is about people mostly who don't, as it were, leave their roots behind, who remain within it, and because of that, their history gets a little bit lost. Could you read us a passage first? Or you might want to disagree with my description of it first.
Can I start by disagreeing?
Yes, you can.
It's always a good move.
I saw the look on your face.
Always a good move. Well, only with the idea that they didn't leave their roots, because in fact they all left, and most of the people in the book are migrants who constantly are moving around. Yes, they are moving,
but not moving necessarily socially in huge degrees.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I thought I'd read a bit from the end of the book, which I hope doesn't give too much away, but it's a bit of a summary. I'll just introduce it with another little bit, and then it's when I'm reflecting, because I try to break up rather precisely some of the social history with moments of reflection, as well as with memoir. I remember exactly when the idea for this book seeded itself. It began with a vision. I was on a train between London and Newcastle, glancing out of the window across the wide open fields of Lincolnshire. The fields were empty, not even a solitary farmer on a tractor, and suddenly I had a sense of how crowded and peopled those acres would have been in earlier centuries. And all at once a swarm of ghosts, nameless, their faces blurred with time, filled my mind. Doing family history, I found that I stood a tiny figure on a jetty or a pier, and stretching far to the horizon before me was the prospect of an infinite past, like an ever-moving sea, rolling toward me and receding. I understand more now why my family seemed to come from nowhere and had nothing. I thought I might find an ancestral place, but what I found was movement. I'm as English as they come, the descendant of migrants from all over the southern counties, Ireland too, and beyond. I've learnt whom I come from. Farm workers and lace makers, carters and caulkers, women who made needles and plied them, saddlers and stay makers, old ladies who washed sailors' rig-outs, young ones who sorted paper and rags, bricklayers and builders, and so many servants. Those who sailed to sea, who fed the engines and the men, shopkeepers and milk boys, paraffin sellers, barmaids, watermen, lifters and loaders and porters, and people who made everything from shirts to churches and the roads they walked away on. Their history is local, national and global as they went about their world, finding work, dreaming their dreams. Southern England was hard hit. Enclosures of land, workhouses and the pauperisation of the labourers drove many out onto the road, and this too is our island story, the other face of the Industrial Revolution, which produced losers as well as winners in a modernising capitalist economy.
Thank you. I like that image that you began with of looking out of the train window at an empty field, because in a sense that's where the book starts, with the sense that your own family history stops very soon, I suppose. What's amazing is how much you can then discover without, as it were, an inherited family history. Were you surprised by?
I was absolutely astonished. I'm not trained as a professional historian. I've never taught history, and I began the book as in an amateur way, as one does, just with a question of wondering whether I would find things, because my family was particularly truncated. My grandmother had been an orphan. My mother didn't know who her grandparents were on either side, really. And on my father's side, his father had moved from Birmingham, and we had no contact with his family. So And like, I think, probably lots of people here tonight, you know, there were no photographs, there were no oil paintings, there were no documents, there were no diaries, no letters, no objects passed on, and no graves. And although I couldn't replace some of those things, it was very heartening, actually, how much we leave behind. There was no one who hadn't left a trace, no one. And even if that trace was in an official record of an asylum, it was very resonant to me. And sometimes all you need is a name with a fact alongside it. And that, you know, it might be the name. I found a lot of women who were in the mental asylum in Portsmouth, where a lot of my family ended up and where I grew up, and they had come from all over the world. So it would be somebody like Lily Jenkins, Ireland, Isle, West Indies, 3 children dead. And each one's like a little novel in miniature, really. I was inundated with material. The problem was to select and shape.
You make the point very well that because sort of formal records or official records tend to concentrate on the beginning of a life and the end of a life, you often get a very distorted account, particularly in the case of lives that have ended in poverty, which many lives did before the welfare state. I mean, that was a destiny.
Nice to hear you using that phrase, as you know, it still exists.
Well, yes, I hope it and will continue to exist. But you very pointedly make the point that it's not enough to say they died in the workhouse, that the richness of a life lies somewhere else.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of sadness in the book, a lot of hardship, but there's also a huge amount of resilience and resourcefulness. And I think because this kind of family history can't be biography, you also, you know, you're constantly surprised, actually, by the information you do find. So when I was looking at one of my grandmothers, who I didn't know, my father's mother, I just had her birth and her death, and then gradually I found out what she did during the First World War. And of course, and she was in the Women's Forage Corps, which is very little known about now. And they were the women who baled up all the hay and all the fodder. So they're the women behind the men behind Warhorse, if you like. And there's a complicated reason, which I won't go into, as to why they've largely disappeared from the story. But she had a fantastic time during the war. They led a very gypsy life, moving around with lads from the army. And I wanted to find a way of writing that wouldn't make death the destination of the story. Because I don't actually believe it is. You know, I don't think our death tells us about our lives. It's not full of life, as it were. So I had to play with that quite a lot, but I also had to be very frank about not knowing things. There was no point in pretending, actually, I thought.
Oddly, though, there was sometimes a paradoxical effect when you did know things. I mean, you write family history, which humanises those who might otherwise be mere faces in a crowd, also defamiliarised those closest to me. Yeah. Because it knitted them back into a social history.
Yes, I mean, if you do this sort of work, I think the phrase I used was killjoy. You know, you start off maybe thinking this might be for your family, and then you realise that the people have to become part of the fabric of history, and that, like all of us, they're not wholly in control of their lives, and they're representative. It doesn't mean they're types, but they then become distant, and the things you find out are often not what family might want to know as well. So I think, you know, you have to keep very open about that.
Well, you repeatedly come back to family myths, which you then,
yes,
which have a charm to them, and yes, and then you come along and say, well, I'm sorry, but it's just not the case.
Yes.
But not always because they're trying to hide a social shame, but sometimes simply because people want a more interesting story.
Well, I think probably we all want a more interesting story than our story, you know, the story that we have. I mean, which of us in the room hasn't talked him or herself up at some point? And I think that's also because we are our fantasies. So I tried in the book, where I could, to talk about the stories I'd heard a story from my grandfather, my mother's father, that it's a very classic English story, that they had fallen on hard times, that we came from a bit of wealth somewhere, there'd been some trouble in the family, he was disinherited, you know, very familiar story. And his mother was never mentioned, my grandfather's mother. We didn't know her name, she was never mentioned. And it turned out that she had died in a mental asylum. So of course the story was in part, I believe, to hide a sense of terrible shame. It was a pauper's asylum. But also I think it gave him power to tell the story. He could reinvent himself. You know, that's what storytelling does. It gives us all scope and room. That's what all the people here have been doing, I think. So I wanted to give the stories credit, not just debunk, really.
You write this, sometimes I wondered what family history was, if not extended mourning. Is it partly a mourning for yourself as well, for ourselves? The knowledge that, as you read this, that we too will one day come down to an entry in a ledger, and did it leave you feeling a little melancholy, the experience of writing this?
Well, I'm slightly inclined to melancholy, as well as humour. I think they tend to go together, the old gallows humour. I think it was partly that. I think it's sobering. I think it's very sobering to look across generations, and I talk about how family history is a very bizarre way of doing history, because you look across generations in a mourning, you go at high speed. You know, like the Grim Reaper, you're watching things generation after generation and going backwards. So you're also watching cities fall away to fields. It's